Founding siècle Prague was one of the most prolific and fascinating centers of modern esotericism. This era was marked by a bitter national struggle between the Germans and the Czechs in Prague. Over 60% of German speakers were of Jewish origin. Some of the Jews of Prague joined one of the vying camps, while others developed their own Jewish identity. As contemporary research has shown, the ethnic groups of Prague not only clashed, but also cooperated and engaged in lively cultural intercourse. This ambiguity can also be seen in modern esotericism, which was practiced and promoted in Prague by Germans, including Christian von Ehrenfels and Gustav Meyring, Czechs, such as Otto Giese and Karl Weinfuter, and Jews, for instance, Berta Fanta and his son-in-law Hugo Berman. On the one hand, modern esotericism served as a means for constructing an authentic identity and for recovering lost national traditions. This is what Boaz argued a minute ago. On the other hand, its well-known eclectic and syncretic character was often used to shatter narrow national boundaries. In this paper, I focus on three members of one of Prague's cultural circles, writers Franz Kafka and Max Brod, and poet and thinker Mordechai Langer. The three were close friends with a deep penchant for irrational wisdom, who influenced one another in the restless spiritual search. The reflections on esotericism and its place in modern life are revealing and penetrating, particularly regarding a most disturbing paradox, the meaning of tradition. It's the meaning of tradition in a modern age. On one hand, the concealed wisdom of the ancients is presented as an indispensable resource for human well-being and rejuvenation. On the other hand, these restored traditions are rarely the complete tradition of the esoteric seer. They are not grounded in his or her religious heritage, but rather rooted in foreign fields, mainly Eastern religions. This, inter alia, is what makes modern esotericism modern. For Kafka, Brod, and Langer, tradition was a most intriguing challenge. Kafka renewed formulation of this perplexing paradox of constructing or reconstructing. Tradition is, as always, poignant. And this is the first quote. All such writing is an assault on all frontiers. It might easily have developed into a new secret doctrine, a Kabbalah. There are intimations of this. Though, of course, it would require genius of an unimaginable kind to strike root again in the old centuries, or create the old centuries anew, and not spend itself with all, but only then begin to flower forth. Before presenting the struggle of Kafka and his friends to strike and invent roots, a glimpse into the esoteric creativity and the sources of inspiration is required. Kafka, born 1883, was influenced by Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy. Brod, born 1884, disapproved of Steiner and was initially attracted to eclectic sources. His youthful mentor, the writer Gustav Meyring, Christian medieval mystics like Silesius, as well as Buddhism were three very different exemplars. From 1909 on, the three friends were deeply affected by Martin Buber's call for a Jewish and universal regeneration based on mystical inspiration and a renewed East-West encounter. They revisited their partly forsaken esoteric Jewish tradition, Kabbalah and Hasidism. Kafka and Brod were assisted by Langer, born 1894, who left his family in 1913 for several years, and for several years was a devout Bez Chassid. Kafka and Brod integrated esoteric symbols, concepts, notions, and motives played in a new key in the fiction. For example, in Kafka's famous parable Before the Law, and in Brod's novel Reubeni, Prince of the Jews. Brod employed Kabbalistic ideas to construct a subversive Jewish transmorality so as to revitalize and redeem Judaism from its exilic degeneration. In addition to fiction, this Prague circle also incorporated esotericism in its thought. Kafka in the Tzurao aphorism, Broad in Paganism, Christianity, Judaism from 1921, and Langer in the Eroticism of Kabbalah from 1923. All developed modern religious thought that was deeply indebted to esoteric traditions. Kafka, Broad, and Langer, very sensitive to the crisis of modernity, were convinced that esotericism was vital for cultural healing. Kafka, in particular, provided some of the most penetrating and iconic accounts of the crisis. All three writers described dissolution, disorientation, family breaks up, and the loss of tradition. However, how could the suggested remedy of esoteric wisdom have an impact without tradition? Needless to say, this question touches upon other issues, including norms and culture. Two opposing answers were suggested by the Prague Circle and others to the paradox of a secret doctrine in an age of de-traditionalism. And I must add that we heard this morning Shulamit saying that she was asked by one of them what is her relation to Judaism. And she said Judaism is concerned with tradition, and I am concerned with the future. And she grew up in a socialist, circular environment. So what I think, what is common to many people that practiced esotericism is that they were detached from their own tradition. So how can they solve the paradox? Because ancient wisdom and Kabbalah is all about tradition. What is Kabbalah if not tradition? I call the first solution national existential esotericism, and the second broken esotericism. National existential esotericism argued that tradition was only heard externally. From a deeper national perspective, the ties of generations of one folk are indestructible. Inherent blood ties between members of one people link one intimately to past generations, making it possible to convey and reshape the traditions of one's folk. Martin Buber, who visited Prague several times, suggested this option in the Zionist Jewish context, greatly influencing the Prague Circle's Zionist creed and spiritual attitude. I see this option as existential and not merely national because in the modern world, mystical revelation is located in the human ego. Moreover, tradition itself is reinterpreted existentially. It is not a textual tradition, but rather the intimate tie of a creative soul to past generations. Furthermore, this option is national, but not parochial. As part of modern esotericism, it has a distinctive cosmopolitan character. The folk is the medium through which the divine message is forwarded. The content of this message, however, is all human. The second answer assumes that in a modern age, a new kind of esotericism is necessary, one inherently without tradition. This new secret doctrine is based upon a radical negative theology that renders the divine unattainable. Elsewhere, I have shown that Sholom's useful mysticism is of one clause with broken esotericism, as defined here, which, in turn, greatly shaped his influential Kabbalah scholarship. I will now outline these two options and some of their basic contours in the Prague Circle's work. Broad's version of national existential esotericism differs from that of his mentor Buber, given the negative theology that he embraced. In his treatise Paganism, Christianity, Judaism, Broad asserts, we cannot realize God in this world. One cannot realize the absolute in the relative. Divinity never descends into our sphere. Broad limits his spiritual pessimism by contending that revelation is rare and elusive, yet can have a tremendous effect upon our life. Broad also declares his belief that there is a secret in our life and argues that the secret reflects the highest sphere. In the upper world, everything is solid, absolute, clear. The secret is close to the absolute. Insofar as the absolute is turned towards us, it is secret. The secret is everywhere. in its name, brought great chance to nature, to paraphrase Max Weber. Ecstatic experiences, rare but nevertheless highly influential, are characterized as manifestation of the secret, and this is the second quote. Everything's become important because of the mystery. This is the way the Zohar puts it. Whatever is above is also below, and whatever is below is also above. In these mystical moments, the deepest secret of life can be grasped. Eternity, not beyond, but rather within life. The secret is especially relevant in order to understand the real essence of Jewish ritual. This is the third quote. The Jewish rites form a living totality. They do not address themselves to the Jew from the outside as just a commandment, but all of them have to do with the secret of the Jewish national existence. Through the fourth spirit, the forms of the Jewish religion communicate in a mysterious way with the individual Jew. It is also essential that they present something creative in which the individual participates naturally. Both stresses the secret aspect of Jewish tradition as a means of preserving the Jewish people in exilic conditions. When this tradition crumbled, Zionism miraculously emerged so as to guarantee Jewish eternity. Thus, tradition has an inner dimension. It can reveal itself in Jewish life even when it seems that the Jew has broken away from the outer tradition. This is how eternity emerges in our lives. Broad's novel, Reubeni Prince of the Jews, retells the tragic story of the first Mashiach, David Reubeni, in order to discuss the most burning questions of Zionism. David is not only a political leader and a devoted forerunner of Jewish regeneration, but also a mystic. Mysticism, for Broad, is a true substrate of messianism. The Jewish people could not be redeemed without a new secret doctrine that will undermine Jewish morality and devotion to strict codes of halakha. This new doctrine has its own subversive tradition from one first Mashiach to another. This is the fourth quote. In the upper worlds, darkness reigns, while the lower worlds are filled with light. The darkness of the upper worlds is only a darkness, of course. Darkness to our obtuse senses, but in reality, too strong a light. David delves into these worlds of darkness and creates a new esotericism in which corporality, sin, and vigor become sacralized. In his letters to Kafka, Broad noted that his Kabbalistic notions were formed in study with Langer. In turn, Langer refers several times to Broad's paganism, Christianity, Judaism in his Esotericism of Kabbalah. The character and content of the two books are significantly different. What they have in common, however, is the existential national grounding of esotericism. The Kabbalist, argues Langer, and this is a quote, projects his whole being, his whole manhood on the infinite. For Langer, this basic notion justifies his psychoanalytic reading into Kabbalah. As a modern esotericist, he underscores the common traits of all secret traditions, but nevertheless argues that only in Judaism are the deep secrets of human existence, and I quote, rooted in the life of the people and unfold their affectivity. The tradition of the Torah is an outer layer of the inner secret tradition, which is harbored in the people and in the individual soul. For Broad and Langer alike, the discovery of a concealed mystical tradition is required for legitimizing something which is commonly seen as immoral and sinful. Homoeroticism for Langer, sexuality and political violence for Broad. Both Broad and Langer sensed the loss of tradition. However, they believed that the ancient secrets of Judaism were not irretrievable, and that these secrets shine through the individual and or the collective soul. It seems, however, that the recovered tradition is essentially different from the traditional one. Kafka, for his part, disbelieved Broad and Langer's solution. He gave us some of the most powerful images of the loss of tradition, like the inability of the Chinese emperors, determined messengers, to reach their disease, or the laws that can no longer be known or comprehended. The fact these laws are the essence of the national existence does not reconstruct the last tradition. The laws are indispensable but not comprehensible. The breaking tradition, however, does not mean the futility of esotericism, just the reverse. According to Kafka, only after tradition was torn apart and the religious community dissolved did esotericism flourish. In a letter to Milena, Kafka diagnosed, and I quote, "Today, most of us don't feel any sense of religious community. Sects are countless, even confined to individual persons. Modern esotericism, however, cannot disclose divine revelation, but rather divine absence." I wish to present briefly two expressions of this notion in Kafka's writings. The first is a scene from Kafka's last unfinished novel, The Castle. In K's fifth attempt to contact the castle, remote and inaccessible, just like God, he tries to make a phone call, and this is the fifth quote. The receiver gave out a buzz of a kind that K had never before heard on a telephone. It was like the hum of countless children's voices, but yet not a hum, the echo rather of voices singing at an infinite distance, blended by sheer impossibility into one high but resonant sound, which vibrated on the ear as if it were trying to penetrate beyond mere hearing. This beautiful account resembles, arguably, a mystical experience, but without any content or connection to a heavenly source. When the phone call suddenly becomes informative, and K asked when he could come to the castle, the reply is cut and dry, never. Later on, he is informed by the mayor that there is no telephone connection from the castle to the village. The way from the village to the castle is blocked. However, a message from the castle reaches out to us, voices singing at an infinite distance. The second expression of this notion is from the Zohar aphorism. And this is the last quote. "I should welcome eternity, and when I do find it, I'm sad. I should feel myself perfect by virtue of eternity and feel myself depressed. You say I should feel. In saying this, do you express a commandment that is within yourself? I hear it, as it were, even when I do not hear it, in such a way that, although it's not audible itself, it muffles or embitters the voice bidding me to do other things. That is to say, the voice that makes me ill at ease with eternity. It is senseless, for only if I do not obey it, I can maintain myself here. Incoherent, for I don't know whose command it is and what he is aiming at. Inevitable, for it finds me unprepared, descending upon me as surprisingly as dreams descend upon the sleeper, who, after all, since he lay down to sleep, must have been prepared for dreams. It is unique, or at least seems to be so, for I cannot obey it. It doesn't mingle with reality, and so it keeps its immaculate uniqueness. It makes me happy or frightens me, both without cause. Though, admittedly, it does the first much more rarely than the second. It is not communicable because it's not intelligible, and for the same reason, it demands to be communicated. The voice of eternity or unity, in another defacement of Kafka's handwriting, descends upon Kafka just as it does upon other mystics. In a modern time, however, it can't be communicated. It does not have a clear meaning, and its addresser is obscure. Nevertheless, its impact upon the addressee is enormous. One can say that it catalyzes Kafka's enigmatic and mesmerizing art, which, like the old Chinese laws, demands and denies interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very short lecture, so we have
I was told
15 minutes.
that I have 15 minutes to talk, so I obeyed this law. I didn't comprehend it, but I obeyed.
So let's begin. Yes.
What law? There is no.
Any questions? No? We can have a little break, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I still try to understand probably I didn't 100% understand what you want to say regarding Kafka first. One point seems to be clear, there is a kind of a loss of tradition, and the second point is how to fill this gap without regaining tradition, a kind of a, and I think the answer is you give is a kind of a negative mysticism, is that right?
Yes.
I would say for Kafka this is a picture you could give and which is interesting. Nevertheless, it's on the contrary also necessary to see what Kafka struggled to put against this, let's say, empty space that he experiences very strong in different places. Zionism on the one hand, and Hasidism, all these interests that try to fill up some or to fill identities or patterns of answers in this empty space, but for Kafka impossible to, in the end, impossible to get them. So I think it's like two movements, and in this respect, Brod is totally contradictory to Kafka. You can't even compare him, because he begins with this indifferentismus, this indifferent position, total relativism is in his early phase, and then he finds the answer, finally. Zionism is the answer, Judaism in general is the answer. So he has a lot of clear-cut answers that regain the lost tradition or fill the gap. So I think they are really different in that respect. So what I was not really sure if it's possible to really compare them just in this tension or in the attitude toward the loss of tradition. And also, and probably the most interesting case seems to be the third one, namely Langer. Because Langer, coming from the assimilated families, looking for Hasidism, going to Belz, living with the Hasidim, but then going back and turning the back to the Hasidim and being interested in psychoanalysis and reading Blüher and so on, having totally different answers to the question of tradition. So he, for a certain moment, finds the answer in a nearly orthodox way, and then drops it again in order for in favor for modern types of solutions like psychoanalysis and so on. So I think there are three very different ways to deal with the problem you addressed.
I think that they are different, but on the other hand, they have one good thing or bad thing in common. I think that, and maybe we're not agreeing at this point, I think that all of them made their best to fill the gap, to restore their tradition, their own Jewish tradition. And Langer took 2 years or more of his life to live in Belz, and Brod did his best to know Hasidism and Talmud, and Kafka also, we know that he learned Hebrew, that he tried to, through the Yiddish theater and so on. But I think that all of them, including Langer and including Brod, finally concluded that the way is closed for them, that the gate of the law is closed. It might be open only for them, but they never could get back. And I think that the most interesting case that, as you mentioned, is Langer, because Langer provided us some very interesting and authentic description of life in Belz, and he says, oh, it's so dirty. And the way that he analyzes and describes life in Belz is totally Orientalistic. So all those people are Western to the bone, as Kafka says. And so the only solution is modern Esotericism, because as we have heard today and probably yesterday, this is a kind of combination between your own tradition, but it's now rephrased and reshaped. So I think that Langer that tried to convey the Hasidic tradition from Belz to the reader. And you have edited this book, 9 Gates of Hasidim, and you know that this is not a sheer passing of tradition. It's a tradition that is reshaped according to Western guidelines, among them psychoanalysis. Yeah. And so I think that there are, of course, difference between the three, but I think that there is also something in common, because all of them cannot use simply the idea that, okay, we'll go back to the tradition. So for Langer and for Broad, I think that the solution comes through Zionism, because Zionism says that you don't have to keep the original tradition, because if you are part of this tradition, you can reshape it very openly. And Kafka was attracted to this solution, and he admired this solution, but I think at the same time he said in his diaries, in his work, that at least for me, for Kafka, it's impossible. So what left? What left is negative mysticism, which means that it's something without tradition. It's a tradition without tradition, and because of that, God is not revealed in his fullness, but in his emptiness. So I think that we agree, but maybe
just one. The second question would actually be, why are you talking about esotericism in this case? I don't see any esotericism.
So what do you see?
I was a little bit provocative, but is Zionism then esotericism? Is Hasidism esotericism in that case? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, what is tradition?
No, I don't.
Okay. It's a blend.
Yeah.
It's a blend of various traditions, various sources.
Yeah.
And for instance, if you read, and you have to get a lot of patience to do that, if you read the 2 volumes of Paganism, Christianity, Judaism, you can see that Broad is indeed influenced from Kabbalah and Hasidut, and from Jewish thought. But is also influenced from Buddhism, and is also influenced from Christian. I think that this book is more Christian than Jewish. So I think that if Esotericism is the eclectic collection of mystical and notions and practices, yes, not only Steiner dealt with there were several versions of esotericism, of people that tried to collect traditions. If you read esotericism of Kabbalah, you can read Kabbalah, you can read Bhagavad Gita, you can read Christian Eckhart, you can see all kinds of mystical traditions that are crumbled together. So,
Max Brod actually wrote a book about Johannes Reuchlin.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The founder of Christian Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
More questions? Okay, so then, yes. Yeah, no, we have time, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think on a purely textual level, that one could make the argument that there is an exoteric and an esoteric reading of certainly Kabbalah, and Kafka, as I'm sure you know, his other great influence was Kierkegaard, right? And that the deployment of irony, right, creates vehicles in which what is said and what is meant are exoteric and esoteric are 2 different things. So in your reading of Kafka, and I'm certainly not experiencing you, I'm just asking, is very earnest, that he's a seeker without something to find. And I'm wondering how, if at all, irony plays into that. And I've read, and this sentence terrified me, Now, Kafka used to read these stories to his family at night, and he laughed and laughed and laughed.
Not his family, his friends. His family would be interested.
And so I'm wondering how irony and humor and esoteric readings of text might figure into this.
This is an excellent remark, because I think that what Steiner misses is irony and humor. And I think that, I hope that nobody I will not irritate no one by saying that that many of his writings are unreadable because he's so serious. And I think that Kafka had integrated irony into his esoteric work. And I think that this opened for him new perspective. And I think that you cannot speak about negative mysticism without irony. And Broad was also very interested in Kierkegaard, but I think that Broad, as a Zionist and as a formal Zionist, I think that he was less ironic than Kafka, and maybe the quality of Kafka's work that Broad lacks is consists in this point of irony. So irony is indeed present in Kafka's work, and I think that it's part of the story, because in modern time we cannot be sure even that this solution of negative mysticism is something real. No, okay? Because he says let's examine the story of the phone call. Okay, you hear angelic voices, but after that, someone is saying, "Hey, Mister, this phone call is not connected." So he built a very beautiful and unique modern mystical experience, and at the same time, he blows up the balloon. So this is part of the story.
Okay, thank you very much, Shimon Lev, Zohar.